All right. Well, it isn't very NetHui to be behind a podium, but we'll do that for now because it's easier. Okay, we'll get another one that works for you guys. So, international internet governance, and Georgina is going to co-facilitate with me, but this is really a session to have a bit of an update about some of the big stuff that's happening. As we've discussed at NetHui, the internet is a global network of networks, and so how it's run and how it's governed is not something that just happens in New Zealand. There isn't a New Zealand internet, it is the internet. And so there are some key processes and some key organizations that are involved in international internet governance. Looking around the room, some of the people here are very involved in some of those organizations and some of those processes, and others might just be here to learn about some of those processes and organizations. So we're going to cover a few of the key sort of things that are going on. We'll start with Georgina, who's going to talk about the World Summit on the Information Society, which is a UN process that's around the internet and information society, but including the internet, which is 10 years and a 10-year review this year. And the future of the internet and the UN and how governance in the UN will happen is being looked at a General Assembly of the UN in December this year. So she'll talk to you about that. Related to the World Summit on the Information Society, I'll talk to you a little bit about the Internet Governance Forum, which was an outcome of that, which is a global meeting that happens every year of all kinds of people getting together to talk about internet policy and issues. And actually, NetHui is modeled on that kind of meeting at a national level. So we'll talk a bit about that. We'll also talk about ICANN, who look after the domain name system and the root servers, and Jordan Carter from Internet NZ will give a bit of an update about explain the organization, but also talk about some really key changes that are happening at ICANN at the moment. And then we'll open up for some discussion, for questions, comments from people who are involved. So I'll hand over to Georgina. So that's actually one that gets used for internet governance stuff. I'm not good at writing on board. NetHui, NetGov.
Awesome. Thanks very much, Alan. And as you said, I'm Georgina Sargison from our Ministry of Foreign Affairs and Trade. I cover our cyber security desk for the Ministry of Foreign Affairs, which includes a whole lot of the international internet governance issues. As Alan said, this year is the 10-year review and 10-year anniversary of the World Summit on Information Society, which was held in 2003 in Geneva and 2005 in Tunisia. This was a landmark United Nations conference which resulted in a new way of thinking about both the internet and ICTs more broadly. It sort of produced a roadmap with the overall goal of achieving an information society where everyone had access to all information society material based on shared knowledge. The outcomes were created by all stakeholders, so not just governments, but civil societies, engineers who are interested, and basically the concept is that anyone that had an interest in these issues was able to participate in these conferences. This was a reasonably significant achievement for the United Nations system, which, as many of you will be aware, is built on the one state, one vote model, where states are the main decision makers for in this forum. Obviously, the internet presents quite a lot of challenges for this model, and this was a method. So this concept of sort of a multi-stakeholder model of internet governance that we talk about a lot now actually was a core outcome of the WSIS process. This was the first time we saw recognised at this type of event that not only governments should have a say in the development of and decisions around how governance decisions are made in internet and ICT use, that everyone who had an interest, including businesses, customers, civil society organisations, have a role to play. as an outcome of these documents, there were 10 targets that were agreed and 11 action lines. The action lines were assigned to various UN agencies to sort of oversee, with the idea that these would be very inclusive and would involve all who wanted to be involved. What the review is designed to do is to examine the targets, the 10 targets, and also look at the implementation of the action lines to assess how we've all done overall, and where there is still areas where we need to sort of look a little bit more closely at how we're doing this internationally and potentially domestically. Because there are 11 action lines, I won't run through them all with you, but they sort of fall into 3 broad categories. One of the big ones is around access and accessibility, which is the idea that ICT can be a public good and that everyone should be able to access information, have the access to infrastructure, and this is where the ICT for development stuff falls in, the idea that access to connectivity can be a major development enabler. Then the second sort of theme is around sort of social challenges and human rights and how we can use the internet and connectivity to protect human rights, and also how we make sure that governance structures are respectful of these core rights. And then the last theme is around governance structures. How do we actually make decisions around how the internet connects with everything, who has the final decision-making rights on what content should be online, and all this sort of thing. As you can probably tell from sort of that very quick overview, these are some quite significant issues, and the World Summit on Information Society review is going to be looking at the full suite of issues around the information society. So sort of unusually from the last 5 years of discussions at this level internationally, we aren't just looking at cybersecurity, or we're not just looking at the question of privacy online. What we're looking at is every single one of these things and how they fit together, and fundamentally how it is that we collectively want the internet to be governed. And that sort of comes back to what I said was that sort of foundational outcome from the first WSIS processes, which was this recognition at the level of the United Nations that internet governance should be multi-stakeholder. This is something that we suspect is going to be quite a key focus of the review, which is based now in New York. Over the last sort of 3 to 4 years, a whole lot of organisations have pulled together inputs to that review, including the International Telecommunications Union and a number of the other UN organisations, including UNESCO. A number of these have held conferences a little bit like this, where they've got people in a room to have a chat about how they think this is all going, what they think we need to focus on for the next 10 years, and what the key issues are that we should be debating. But that the final review itself will be held in, as Alan was saying, the United Nations General Assembly, which means that New Zealand's voice will be represented by, actually in this case, the Ministry of Foreign Affairs, so the government. What we're very keen to ensure is that when we are there in December having a discussion about the review outcomes, that we have a sense of what everyone here, what all civil society stakeholders, all businesses, everyone that has an interest in these issues, what you all think of these things, what the key issues are for us from a New Zealand point of view, but also what we think the key issues are internationally, and how we think internet governance should look for the next 5 to 10 years. This will probably be a reasonably fraught discussion within the United Nations context. As many of you will be aware, while New Zealand is a very strong international proponent of the multi-stakeholder model, not every state is an equally strong proponent of that. We can expect a number of governments to be pushing very strongly for them to have a much clearer role in internet governance decisions, and in many cases have the ultimate decision-making authority over these decisions. This may also include wanting to actually clearly define the role for the United Nations and actually give the UN itself, so the UN General Assembly, a role in making decisions, for example, over domain names, which is something that from a New Zealand government perspective we don't think would work, but that is something that some governments are interested in doing. So today, after we've kicked kicked around a couple of the other issues that are going on internationally. Really keen to get views from the room on these issues, things that you think New Zealand's done really well around things like access to information, things you think we perhaps haven't done so well, and some of your thoughts about how we want to represent these views on the international stage. And now I will kick over to Jordan to talk about ICANN, and then Alan will talk about the IGF, which was one of the concrete outcomes of the WSIS review, and one of our goals for this upcoming review will be around extending the mandate for that organisation.
This is sort of un-NetHui behaviour, so I apologise for being behind a barrier. Who here has heard of ICANN? Put your hand up. Who here feels like they've got more than a passing acquaintance of knowledge with ICANN? Okay, I'm going to do this as a kind of beginner spiel, and I think what I'm trying to get across is just some key debates that are happening in ICANN at the moment, not to summarize all of ICANN, which is good, because otherwise we'd be here for 2 years. ICANN is it's a subset of the multi-stakeholder internet governance system. It has a very focused role on coordinating the DNS, and in some areas making policy for it, or validating the policy from various DNS communities like country code domains like .nz. And within that very limited, it has that limited remit as a kind of organization that was set up to be the vehicle for DNS policy making. I would like to do that if I could. Yeah.
Test.
DNS, that's on, the domain name system. Yeah, good point, thanks. And so that, I've completely lost track of where I was. Mic change. It was set up at kind of the instigation of the US government to be a stakeholder-led and run organization that would do DNS policy instead of a government department doing it, and instead of the kind of individual who had pulled together a lot of those decision-making, John Postel, up until then. And the USG set it up with the vision that it would be privatized, that the remaining links with the US government would be coming to an end. And when that organization was started in 98 or so, I think the original view was that would happen in 2000 or so. Well, it's 2015. A few iterations and versions of the contract have gone by. The USG role through its contract with ICANN has slowly diminished over time. It's a less intrusive relationship than it was. In 2009, a bilateral affirmation of commitments was signed between ICANN and the USG to encourage it to be a transparent, open, multi-stakeholder organization in its approach. And last March, the USG announced it wanted to complete that privatization process and draw its last contractual links between ICANN and the USG to an end. And so essentially to say to the global multi-stakeholder community was the language, the global internet community, this is your baby, this is your responsibility, you must manage this common resource in the public interest. And since then the ICANN community has been beavering away to come up with a transition proposal that would say how policy was going to be maintained, how the system would operate at the end of that contract. And there are three communities with interest here. There's the domain name community, there's the protocol parameters community, and there's the IP address numbering community. And the numbering and protocols people did their work pretty quickly, and they came up with their transition proposals by January this year. The domain name community is a more complicated beast to do this transition for the simple reason that for numbers and protocols, their policy decisions get made outside the ICANN framework and kind of ratified or implemented. ICANN does what it's told by external bodies. For names, at least in the GNSO area, the global generic top-level domains like .com or .pink or whatever, policy is all made within ICANN. ICANN authorizes the registrars. It's a much more complicated intermingling of that policy process and also the so-called IANA operations where the decisions about what's in the root are implemented. So names was more complicated, but last month in Buenos Aires, the names community finally settled on its draft proposal. So there's a coordinating committee that's got to weave these three proposals into a coherent, interoperable whole, and then propose that to the USG with a few steps in between. At least 2 members of that committee, I think, are in this room. Keith Davidson over there, wave your hand. Noelle Clark over here. Are there any other ICG members here? 2 is pretty good. There are only 19 of them, so yeah, we've got almost 1/10 of the group in the room. And so over the next few weeks and months, they'll be assessing those proposals. They might have questions back to the communities. They might have incompatibilities that require changes to one or more that get pushed back to the communities. But I think the hope is that at the next ICANN meeting in October, they'll be able to sign off and say, this is good to go. In parallel with this transition process, the ICANN community said, there's an important accountability link that's a reality of this contract with the US government. The US government can use the leverage of the contract. It could threaten to reallocate the IANA functions to another organization. And the USG has used the influence that gives it to help shape ICANN into a more transparent, more accountable organization. Without that contract, the ICANN community, or large parts of it, feel that new accountability measures are needed. An improvement in the corporation's accountability to the community is required. Now, that wasn't in the US government's initial thinking or in ICANN's initial thinking when the transition process started last March. But a whole cross-section, the entire cross-section of ICANN constituencies got up in the London meeting in the middle of last year and said, hang on a minute, accountability is important. ICANN pushed back and finally surrendered at the Internet Governance Forum in September last year and said, okay, accountability improvements, we hear the message, we're going to do that. So a working group was set up to work on those improvements starting in December last year. It had a first proposal out for discussion in May. And I am one of the members of it for my sins, is trying to come to a consensus of a second draft proposal by the end of July for a 40-day comment period. If there's consensus that emerges around that, it too will be signed off in October. So in the perfect world that I'm now talking about, in October, a lot of these decisions will get ratified and implementation steps will begin. And implementation of bylaws changes and process changes in ICANN and so on to bring these new settlements into existence will finish sometime early mid next year. And mid to late next year, the US government and ICANN will let the functions contract expire. And this brave new experiment of a global infrastructure free of state control will take flight. So I don't think I need to say much more about that except to suggest that that timetable is a bit optimistic in this sense. That names bit, the transition proposal bit that I talked about first, is contingent and dependent on the nature of the accountability settlement that gets put into place. And there are some bumps and disruptions, as you might expect, when an institution that's got hundreds of millions of dollars and hundreds of staff and a very strong internal culture of self-sufficiency and satisfaction about its own way of operating, sees constraints being taken away from it on the one hand, and then faces a community pushback to make sure that it remains accountable in future. And it is not yet clear. That process is still in the bumpy stage. It still isn't clear to me, as a participant in that working group, whether consensus is going to be able to be arrived at. So there are some risks to the accountability side, which in turn create risks for the entire transition. Because if a new accountability settlement that people can buy into cannot be reached, the names part of the transition proposal cannot go ahead. And then no one knows quite where we will be, but it won't be a good place. So that's one of the key risks, is the next sort of 10 or 12 weeks of accountability discussions. So quickly wrap with how you could participate. There's a lot of information on the ICANN website about these issues. It isn't always the most penetrable stuff, but the blog on the ICANN website does have relatively readable summaries of where this is up to. They just published the 7th of those summaries. So you could have a look at the ICANN website. If you're interested in the transition proposal, you could grab Keith Davidson or Noelle Clark. They're both, well, Noelle is on Twitter. Keith uses email, I think. It's Steam-driven email. You can talk to me if you'd like to talk about the accountability stuff. And I have no doubt there are other people in the room. Chris Lahat is the ICANN ombudsman and has a lot of knowledge about how ICANN works, if you're interested. And there'll be other people here with information as well. So I hope that was what you were looking for, session people. Thanks.
All right, so it's a big, is that going? Information download to start. It is, that's right. All right, so I'll just wrap up this sort of update bit and we can get to some questions. But I think from those two, you can see, we have the UN system trying to deal with the internet, and the complexities of it, talking about another an internet international organization, something that's come about because of the internet, working to figure out how do you govern an international, global network. And so it's a question that we're working it out as we go along, with internet governance. This is all something that is developing, it's evolving. And so one of the things that was created as we set out of the WSIS, the World Summit on the Information Society process, was to have a different sort of meeting, saying, all right, this UN meeting, other organizations, we need something that acknowledges that we are evolving and making this up as we go along, that we have all kinds of people from business and government and parts of the community who are involved in doing stuff that makes the internet. And that we need to get them together to talk to each other and help shape the future of the internet. So the Internet Governance Forum was established as an outcome, and it's an annual meeting that takes place in different places around the world to bring together all these different stakeholders to talk about the future of internet governance. And many of the people who are involved in ICANN and from different government agencies and involved in the UN system go to that, as well as other groups, people from civil society organizations from around the world. Big business is there to get together and have a discussion. It is unique in that it doesn't have outcomes, it doesn't have binding policy. It's about inspiring and connecting people. And it has, a special role in terms of helping evolve that future and thinking about where we go. And so it's linked to this review, though, that it does have funding from the UN and a mandate to happen because of the UN and the WSIS process. It happened for 5 years. It got an extension for 5 more. And so that expires this year. So the next one is in November in Brazil. And really will be up to this WSIS process, whether the IGF, the Internet Governance Forum, goes forward. Now, during that 10 years, one of the things that's happened is they've realized that, while it's great to get people together at a global level, and these events are big, they're like 3,000 people, plus a lot of people online, that isn't all the people that are running the internet. And so there are regional and national initiatives that have sprung out of it. And so NetHui is actually an example. So it's our New Zealand Internet Governance Forum, which we're in our 5th year. But when we thought, Internet Governance Forum, we want something that's really New Zealand. So NetHui. But that there is an Asia-Pacific regional one, so there tend to be quite a lot of nationals. I don't have the numbers, actually. But then also regional Internet Governance Forums that take place. And those have a network that meet at that international one, and also just talk about what is the role, how do you link these together? So that's a big discussion is, should it be a flow from national to regional to international, or like the internet itself, is it just a network of networks, that communicate with each other and work together as is appropriate? So we're just evolving, figuring out how this happens. And so this is a really, I'm quite keen with that bit of background to really open up discussion and say, this is about evolution. It's a really complex area, but it's really interesting in that it is, a lot of existing systems are struggling, to sort of work with the internet, and even new things that were created for the internet as it grows and changes, and political, economic challenges, social challenges. How do you address those within governance frameworks that engage everyone? So with that, I will ask for, any questions and comments. Maybe if we sort of start with the World Summit. I know that Georgina was really keen to sort of hear feedback, but was there anybody who'd like to start? Oh, right, yeah.
Keith Davidson, and I was a member of the New Zealand team that went through the WSIS process and had some of the words that I used are actually in the Tunis agenda, the outcome of the WSIS process. So I think I can speak with a little bit of authority on the subject. But one of the things that was contested strongly all the way through in the establishment of the outcomes of WSIS was this idea of the IGF, and that it be a forum for dialogue, like NetHui is a forum for dialogue. It's not a decision-making forum. It's a place where all stakeholders can meet and participate on an equal footing, and very, very important to recognise the equal footing. I think it causes controversy. I think in the developed world, governments tend to think that they can participate equally, and they do. Whereas in the developing world, governments like to speak on behalf of everybody in their country and assert that they are acting in the best interests of their country and so on. But very much the idea was to leave local jurisdictions to create their own laws, and that the IGF be a discussion forum so that you could understand the problems better. Now, one of the main points of contention in the WSIS review that's going on now is, should the IGF become a decision-making forum? Should it actually have some documented outputs? Should it be the place where you're fighting cybercrime? Should it be the place that will resolve international privacy concerns? How do you align international policies on things like privacy between what China might consider appropriate with what New Zealand might consider appropriate, and so on. And I think maybe that is a good discussion point for this group to follow on in terms of giving our government a lead as to whether or not it would be nice or preferable to somehow change that IGF model or retain it in its current dialogue form, so that more governments and more people can understand the opposing views and make decisions at a local level. So thank you.
John Brewer. I attended the Asia Pacific Regional Internet Governance Forum last week, and I'm sorry about that. Can you all hear me? So APR IGF, that's a mouthful to say, in Macau, and I did that primarily so I could participate in discussion on internet access technologies in developing markets. However, one of the things that happened at this forum was an outcomes document. And now, reading about this outcomes document, apparently last year at a multi-stakeholder group meeting in Delhi, it was decided that regional internet governance forums meetings might try producing some outcomes. You know, outcomes? I think it's a great idea. It was my first internet governance forum, and I thought it made a lot of sense. There was vehement opposition from the crowd, and people stood up and lectured on procedure for about 45 minutes. But in the end, we do have an outcomes document from that meeting, and I'll tell you, it aims to document the input from participants at the IGF and is not intended to be representative of the diverse Asia-Pacific region. It's the hope of the meeting that the outcomes documents can drive participation in the movement and allow for a platform to project voices, views, and thoughts in Asia-Pacific region. So I think it's interesting that we could all get together and have this meeting and have a collaborative document where we could at least summarize the issues that we discussed, and then have that to point to our local governments and local internet organizations as this is what the community at this meeting was thinking.
Any other thoughts about the role of decision-making, outcomes, or... Yeah.
Just a question. Thanks. David Ferret. Georgina, you said the UN General Assembly will be having a debate and possibly a vote on this. What will be the status of any decisions made by the General Assembly? As I understand it, unlike many bodies where it has to be consensus, that can be a majority vote. But am I right in thinking that they can sort of say this is what we think, but that doesn't necessarily have any ability or impact? But I'd be interested in your view on sort of what are the possible outcomes from that.
Thanks, Alan. Thanks, David. This is actually, so there is a UN General Assembly meeting. It's was the subject of quite heated debate what this meeting was actually going to be called. The end outcome is that it's a high-level meeting, which in classic international diplomacy speak means that you can basically allow states to choose what they define as high level. But it's sort of initially been targeted from the UN perspective at ministerial level attendance. So that's the December sort of meeting, which will be considering an outcomes document of the review. That process has commenced already. The first set of meetings, both government meetings and then broader stakeholder meetings, were held in New York last week. I understand from colleagues who were at the stakeholders meeting that it was a reasonably free-flowing discussion, but very much sort of around process and where to from here. There will be 2 negotiation sessions, which will be sort of taking this concept of an outcomes document that we just heard about here and turning it into actual debates on text. So do we actually think X or Y, which Keith will recall from his experiences in this to start with. We would expect that that's really where, so sort of that's at officials level, slightly lower level than your high level meeting, and will only involve, so the negotiations will only involve governments. This isn't something that we, from a New Zealand perspective, think necessarily entirely embodies the multi-stakeholder model, but this was sort of the compromise option that the General Assembly voted on at the end of last year around how they were going to set this up. There are sort of a number of ways that this could go. You're right that the General Assembly votes on texts, and you can have a situation where you get 100 votes for, 92 votes against, but that document or that resolution will still pass. In this case, there would be, the ideal outcome would be that we would agree a consensus text, because this is around a review of something that was a consensus text to start with, and it will be binding in a sense, because it will, as it did previously, it created clear roles at an empowered UN-led bodies to come into existence or to take on new authorities. So depending on how the outcome document gets shaped, that will change those roles that the agencies potentially are undertaking. So one of the big controversies you get in the International Telecommunications Union, for example, is around whether the ITU has a role in cybersecurity, and if so, what that role is. That debate all stems from a WSIS action line around precisely what that actually means. So if we do get to a point where the review document changes any of these things, it will, and it passes, it will be binding. And again, with this decision around the IGF mandate renewal, if it's decided by everyone that we don't think the IGF should continue to exist, then it will no longer exist in its current form. It may well be that it decides to continue on in a separate way. As I said, I think the consensus outcome is what we will be aiming for, as you do with any text. But one of the things that I would, really encourage anyone that's got an interest in this process to do is to keep an eye on this debate, which will be coming up. You'll see mentions of it in ICANN. There are websites. The ITU runs their own WSIS review website you can put in feedback through to, because it does allow us to get a better sense of what stakeholders in New Zealand are actually interested in and what you want the outcome to look like, and informs our decisions about how we go about shaping that. Cool. Any further thoughts or questions from the floor?
Can I do a follow-up?
Yeah.
Thanks, that was very useful. If they went outside areas they have control of, such as WSIS, and passed a resolution saying that the ITU should be in charge of domain names, or that the GAC of ICANN should have veto over the board, what status does that have in terms of that? Is it an expression, or does that actually then require member states to go along?
getting into areas of quite delicate international law, so forgive me for being slightly vague, but it very much depends on the text of the resolution. So if you spend any time, which I'm sure many of you don't, reading UN resolutions, you will see that they tend to be relatively short but very carefully crafted, and it may say, the UN Security Council or the UN General Assembly requires member states to do X, in which case that is a binding requirement for member states to do whatever that is. It may say something like encourages member states, or encourages member states to consider, or member states may wish to do X or Y, in which case it's not a binding requirement. What the complexity of your question is that's at a UN level. If the UN was to pass a resolution on something like cybercrime that cut across existing international law somewhere else, which ideally obviously wouldn't happen, then you get into a question of who actually has authority to make those decisions. Was it actually a UN authority to change the authorities of a cybercrime body, or did that actually, the authority that organisation holds, does that stem out of something else, in which case that would not apply? I think the way the WSIS documents themselves are written, with many of Keith's genius ideas apparently, I'm kidding, they're not too much into this sort of binding requirements. It's targets and encouraging things rather than you must do X, which is what the review is basically designed to look at. How have we done against these targets and these action lines? Are they working for us? Are they not? Do we think there are areas that we need to consider? And one of the things that I didn't say in my intro but is a big consideration is how this process connects with another set of UN discussions, which is around the post-2015 development goals, which is about what are the targets that the international community are setting for themselves in terms of development, both economic and human development, for the next 10 years. And there is a real scope here for, as many of you will be much more aware than I am, for ICT and connectivity to really propel development goals. It gives you an opportunity to deliver education outcomes to rural communities in a way you couldn't previously because there was no road to them and things like that. So something that we're very interested in from a New Zealand government perspective is in talking in the WSIS about how we can better connect these two processes so that they're working towards the same overall goals.
Just a follow-up to David's question about the possibility that the UN might instruct the Government Advisory Committee within ICANN to do something. I'm not sure but whether it's a written rule or an unwritten rule, but in the broader sense, multilateral or multi-governmental organisations will never instruct another multilateral organisation to do something. So I wonder if that's written, unwritten, or just a binding kind of condition.
Yeah, I'm actually not 100% sure on that myself, Keith, but they don't. So they do tend to encourage or ask them to consider rather than you must go forth and do this. But I'm not sure if that's because of some ancient procedural rule or if that we'll just understand that that's not meant to happen.
I'd just like to draw a line in the sand to I get a clear understanding. But everything seems to be fairly stable about the naming conventions, the IPA v6 or whatever, and IETF. Are there any major changes being agitated in these areas, or do we seem to be a period of stability?
So some of the large changes going on here are internationalized domain names and universal acceptance. So the idea that all systems should be able to operate in all languages. So people should be able to have domain names that are in their own characters and email addresses that are in their own language characters. That's a huge change, and that requires a lot of work from everybody.
I actually think actually the opposite of what you said. I think probably it's the biggest change happening at international governments for names, certainly in probably the last 25 years, with the potential role or no role of the American government. So IDNs is just one example, but I think we're at the cusp of major change. Hopefully that works out well. I think the status quo isn't working at the moment, but at least it's not broken. So I think we're in major transition in the next 6 to 24 months. If the process that...
Sorry, are you talking about other languages?
No, names, like domain names. The future of domain names at a super high level at the root is fundamentally in transition at the moment with the planned exit of the American government with its governance oversight. So two people in the room are both in. So I think it's quite critical. And in fact, I know some people have been waiting a very long time for this to happen. And hopefully, as an end user, I hope it works out well, because we've got one good shot at this, and if it doesn't work, we're balked. So.
Can I just ask first, before I say anything, who here remembers bang paths to the nearest well-known host? Thank you. I would hate to see us go back to that. And every time this internet governance thing comes up of stripping the control away from this group and giving it to that group, I have this fear of breaking the DNS. Because at the end of the day, the DNS is just a convention. I'm quite technically capable of running a root server on my own hardware and telling people, go to this and you'll get this whole bunch of new domains. I mean, I'd never do it because I think it would be wrong, but technology would allow it. And, you know, the balkanisation of the internet naming system, I see as being one of the big risks of all this. Can I just ask, you know, what steps are we taking to sort of try and ensure this never happens?
So you're suggesting that ISIS couldn't do this? Or ISIS could do this? ISIS could do it. I could do it.
So I think one of the answers to that question is, one of the reasons the USG started to move was that they feared if they tried to keep control through the contract that they've got, that it would increase the pressures for balkanization, that in part, and not really connected, but connected in some people's minds, the Snowden revelations meant that there was a suspicion of USG control of this part of the internet infrastructure, and that if it wasn't transitioned away from that control, one of two things happened. Either the balkanization risks would increase at the global level and the global route might break, or on the other hand, that I've forgotten what the other hand was, actually. But, or that, it's that it might get dragged into an intergovernmental solution. So it might end up in the International Telecommunications Union, on the basis of saying one government is bad, but 170 or 190 governments is good. That's not a logic that I support. But I think that was part of the pressure there. The other is that all of these changes are going through with very tough scrutiny from the technical community. So I think that unintended consequences that would break the route in per se are being thought about and challenged in the process.
Keith Davidson again. Just one thing that we haven't touched on in terms of the ICANN or the IANA transition from the US government. The US government have made it very clear in their documentation that it will only hand on to a multi-stakeholder organisation. So already governments are aware, the ITU are aware that this is not an item that's up for debate. The US government will remain in charge if there isn't a satisfactory multi-stakeholder community ready to take over. So one of the pressures on Narelle and I and the others on the ICG is to measure that consensus is achieved by the communities who are subscribing to the development of the transition plan. And then To develop Jordan's initial comments too, within ICANN there are the GTLDs like .com and .net who are contracted parties by ICANN and bound to ICANN for a lot of their policies, and then there are the CCTLDs like .nz and .au who are non-contracted parties or have very loose contractual arrangements with ICANN and preserve their right to create policies outside of the ICANN vehicle and then provide those policies to the ICANN board, and they become binding unless there's dissent amongst the multi-stakeholder community. So, and then again for the CCTLDs, it's really important to recognise that there are issues of sovereignty that do exist around the operation of the CCTLD. Some governments like to take over or run their CCTLD because they believe it's something like a company's office or something like that. Other governments like New Zealand are much more enlightened and allow Internet NZ to continue to run it in the interim, but from 1988 or 89 when we were first delegated in .nz, there was probably no reason why government would have been interested at that time. Now that banking and commerce and communications are utterly reliant on that technology, you can't blame government for being very interested in how secure and stable we run .nz and so on too. So there's a great deal of controversy around the different status of CCTLDs versus GTLDs, and this transition is an issue that must be of concern to the New Zealand government and to all New Zealanders as well. This is probably the biggest change at the core of the internet since the release of the World Wide Web in 1993, so it is an important moment, and it is only a fleeting moment that you have to tell Narelle and I and the other members of the ICG what it is that concerns you and so on, because within weeks we will be making final decisions around the creation of the final proposal. Thank you.
Possibly by mistake or just through lack of planning, I didn't actually talk about what the arguments we've been advancing on the substance of this ICANN debate. So in 1 minute or two, on the transition plan stuff that Internet NZ's position has been to share some lessons for how we organise .nz, which is to say that the policy making in respect to the domain should be separate from the operation of it. So we have the Domain Name Commission that does the policy and contractual framework for .nz, and we have NZRS, the registry company that operates the register and the DNS. And so that argument has won some weight in the proposal from the names community, where there's a separate company being proposed with an ICANN to operate the IANA functions, separating the operation of those core registers from the policy-making functions of ICANN. And on the accountability side of things, we are pushing for strong and enforceable accountability tools that relocate authority a bit more distributed away from just the ICANN board into the various stakeholder groups that make up the ICANN community. So those are the substance of what we're doing. I'll try and put a blog post out on it and tweet it with NetHui NetGov next week to give a bit more space to explain that.
Right, so we're just running out of time. In the interest of enabling participation, I just wanted to say, is there anybody who hasn't had a chance to speak?
I should add that in terms of accountability, one of the other things they're looking at is some of the dispute resolution systems within ICANN, because one of the ways you hold an organisation accountable is having the ability to raise a dispute. And my own office as the ICANN Ombudsman is the if you like, the first step in accountability, because I look at issues of unfairness within the ICANN community. And there are certainly suggestions that my function would be substantially increased and changed by that. They're also looking at changes to the reconsideration process, where the board can reconsider decisions that are made that affect people. And also there's a top level called the Independent Review Panel, and it's like an arbitration process, and people are also looking at that. All of these things, and including the the wider changes which Jordan is talking about are something where you can make a contribution. Everybody here is able to go onto the ICANN website. They're all, I think, still available for public comment. You can look at what's there, and as Jordan says, it's sometimes a little bit opaque to find exactly what you want, but anybody can make comment, and I think everybody who's involved in the process would say, please make comment, because we need diverse views. We don't just want North American views. We want views from right across the world.
Thanks, Chris. Were there any other questions or comments from people looking to participate? All right. Well, we are 1 minute till we finish, so I think we will wrap up this session. Thank you very much. I think for those of you, there are ways to contribute, and certainly the people who've spoken, are involved in processes. So grab them at afternoon tea if you want to know more, but, looking online. Thank you so much for the session.